We all know about hardware, software, malware, maybe even know a thing or two about ransomware, but there are so many more classifications out there, one of those being Protestware, with famous examples being, in no particular order, PolyMC, LeftPad, ColorsJS, FakerJS, and CoreJS. But what makes something Protestware? And is that a good or a bad thing? And when something becomes Protestware, is it always Protestware? Well, all of this and more is what I'm going to try to explain in this video. So let's start with the name, Protestware. As the protest part of the name might suggest, this is a category of software which basically exists to protest something. What that something is entirely dependent on the developers in the project. For example, in the LeftPad situation, the LeftPad developer had a separate project called Kick. When the company Kick came along, not the streaming site, the original Kick, came along and said, hey, stop that, we're going to have a package named Kick, he was like, you know what? I have this LeftPad thing, which is a dependency for half the internet, I'm going to delete it. But then there are other cases like ColorsJS, FakerJS, and CoreJS, where the developer was basically protesting massive companies taking advantage of FOSS. These multi-billion-dollar companies that are built on these open source projects and don't pay them anything. Their entire business is reliant on this software working well, and they don't give them any funding. But then there are cases that are radically different and have nothing to do with corporate exploitation, like PolyMC, where one of the founders of the project basically kicked everybody else out with the exception of a couple of people because he felt like leftist politics were invading the project and were going to eventually destroy it. But even in those cases where the goal is similar, sometimes the approach is radically different. Like in LeftPad, for example, the developer deleted LeftPad from NPM, basically causing dependency chaos, whereas in ColorsJS and FakerJS, the developer released an update, causing it to print unexpected text. But then CoreJS, the developer released an open letter, basically pleading his case and explaining why funding is so important. Now, one thing to note about Protestware is we generally don't use the term when talking about a compromised project. Things like Koa, RC, UA Parser, and all other manner of projects where developer credentials have been stolen and then things are being pushed to the repo that are not supposed to be pushed. In some cases, a repo may be compromised with the intention to protest something. Usually you'll see this happen in the cases of ransomware attacks and things like that, like say, drivers are stolen and someone's going to release them to the public unless they are made open source, things like that. But generally we only use the term when talking about the actual developers of a project deciding to protest something. Now there is a separate case for a project fork that is protesting something, but I'll get into that in just a bit. Also, unlike things like malware, generally Protestware doesn't begin its life as Protestware. Usually for most of its life, it's regular old software, people are just using it, as a regular project. It builds up an audience and then eventually becomes Protestware. Think of it like this, right? If you see a random GitHub project that has like 5 stars, nobody really cares if it's trying to protest something. Sure, maybe you care about the protest, but it's a 5-star project, it's not really going to affect anyone. Whereas something like LeftPad, for example, when that became Protestware, it was being used as a dependency by basically half the internet. Things like CoreJS, that's being used by some of the biggest websites out there, like Amazon, Alibaba, and all of these other crazy sites. So when they do something, people are going to notice it. But there are cases where a project is Protestware from its inception. The best example of this are protest forks. These are forks of an existing project made to protest something. Usually it's some sort of change the project is making that users aren't exactly happy with. Great example of this are things like the Braver browser, a fork of Brave, Glimpse, a fork of GIMP, Tenacity, a fork of Audacity, and Audacium, also a fork of Audacity. And I hadn't really thought about it like this, but I guess also Prism Launcher, a fork of PolyMC. But it's a really weird fork, because it's all of the developers from PolyMC who got kicked out of the project. So technically, it's more original than the original, but that's a whole separate topic. But the issue with protest forks is they're a protest fork, so most of them only survive while the protest is actually going on. When people get bored, they don't really see any reason to keep using the project and go back to the original. Now, Braver is a bad example here because they were just stepping all over Brave's trademark and Brave was going to sue them. But a better example here is Glimpse, Tenacity, and Audacium. Audacium, which has now been marked as archived. So, Glimpse, this was a fork of GIMP, and their main goal was to remove the offensive branding in GIMP, the GIMP name. They wanted to remove a lot of the Easter eggs from GIMP and make it a more professional project, along with, in the long run, giving it a cleaner UI and things like this. Whereas Audacium and Tenacity were protesting Muse Group purchasing Audacity, bringing in some data collection stuff, and also bringing in a contributor license agreement. The biggest problem with a protest fork's long-term success is justifying its existence. Why should I go and use the protest fork instead of using the original? And not just using it. Why should I help develop the protest fork instead of just developing the original? And many projects like Glimpse and Audacium are just not able to keep up that steam long-term into the future. Now, I believe a lot of the people that did work on Audacium now work on Tenacity, and this one does have, an update cycle. It's fairly slow, it's not being developed anywhere near the pace of Audacity, but it is still being developed. Whereas Prism Launcher, this is completely different. Because everybody left PolyMC, all the developers are now here, so it's the original project that is completely dead. But most projects don't go through this. Most of the time, people just go back to the original. But when a fork does make it through that, when a fork stops being just a fork and becomes its own separate project with its own reason for existing, I think that's the point where a protest fork or protestware stops just being protestware and becomes a project in its own right. And there is another category of software with quite a few success stories. The protest distros. Linux distros that exist for protesting, say, systemd, like Devuin, based on Debian, or Artix, based on Arch Linux. Distros that exist for protesting proprietary software, like Parabola, for example. I should have opened it because it's a very slow page. Parabola. Even though all of these started with the sole purpose of protesting systemd or protesting proprietary software, and in the case of Devuin, still very heavily features that messaging on their site, even so, these projects have existed for years and now exist in their own right, separate from those original projects. Now, I have my opinions on each of these individual projects, and I think I've done a video on pretty much all of them, with the exception of Artix. But regardless of how I personally feel about them, the state of being protestware is neither a good or a bad thing. It's not like we're talking about malware or ransomware where it's being used in a malicious context or used to demonstrate how it can be used in a malicious context. Whenever you come across protestware, I encourage you to look into why it is protesting something, why it is protestware, and come to your own conclusions on that specific project. But maybe you disagree, and you feel like protestware is always bad because it's getting in the way of people trying to do their work. Or maybe you think it's always good because it's always a good idea to stand up for what you believe in. I would love to know. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. And if you liked the video, go and like the video. And if you really like the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon Scribes to Libera Pay linked in the description down below. That's going to be it for me, and PolyMC is very dead, no matter what Lenny wants to say about it.
Daytime better come correct. Ain't playing at your best, then you will get left. If it don't involve money, then I don't accept. If it don't involve money, then I don't accept. Something like this.